what I'm talking to you about is, in a very general way, the debate in Quebec over the relationship between state and religion, and more specifically how this debate has involved and affected the Hasidic community in Montreal over the years, right? So the first part of my talk, I want to tell you a little bit about traditional Quebec society and what was called the Quiet Revolution, which happened in the 1960s and 70s, when Quebec went from being a society that was largely under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church to perhaps the most secularized society in all of North America, as odd as that might sound. And it happened very, very quickly. In that period of modernization, there was an interest in the Hasidic community, but it was an interest, as we'll see, that was mostly framed by a kind of exoticism, right? In more recent years, with larger waves of immigration to Quebec and to Montreal, especially from countries with large Muslim populations, there's been a debate over what's called reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is a policy that's really meant to apply to things like physical handicaps. In other words, businesses have to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with physical handicaps so that they can participate in the labor force. But the term got extended to religious issues, and we'll talk about that. With that came a move in Quebec to encode in law relationships between the state and religion, and between the public display of religious symbols by people working for the state. And that in turn has led to a new interest in Hassidim, who, while they're not the prime target of these laws, are of course implicated by them because they wear conspicuous religious symbols. So that's kind of the arc of what we'll talk about. But to begin at the beginning, as they say, I begin with this winter scene of Montreal. So Montreal, of course, is named for the mountain that's in the middle of the city, which is an island in the St. Lawrence River, Montreal. And as you'll see, on the top of the mountain is a cross, an illuminated cross. Right now, legend has it that when Sieur de Maisonneuve came from France, and when Sieur de Maisonneuve came from France and established the city of Montreal in 1642, he planted a cross on the top of the mountain to claim the island for the King of France, right? Perhaps. But in any case, in the early 20th century, the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste, the St. John the Baptist Society. Saint Jean-Baptiste is the patron saint of French Canadians, just as he is of Catalans, for example. They decided that they would put a new cross at the top of the mountain, and what's significant is that it's facing east. And in Montreal, the division between English and French was geographically a west-east divide. So on the west side of the mountain lay the English community, and on the east side of the mountain lay the French community. So the cross was there to remind the French community of its traditions and its roots. And I talked about this morning. The Saint Jean-Baptiste Society defended this idea of notre langue, notre foi et nos institutions. Our language, French, our faith, Catholicism, and our institutions, the church and its associated institutions. But at the foot of the mountain, in this neighborhood, there were French Canadians, but there was also a large Jewish population, a huge Jewish population. This is where the majority of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe lived. And their lives in this period are immortalized in novels by writers such as Mordecai Richler, for example, but also many Yiddish writers, like the ones I talked about this morning, like Joseph Siegel. So imagine a community at the foot of the mountain that looks up every night and sees this illuminated cross. which wasn't meant for them, right? It was meant for people even further east. How would they feel about this? Well, of course, we know that most of the Jewish immigrants who came to Montreal in this period came fleeing persecution, fleeing pogroms, fleeing retribution and retaliation when they were held responsible by each side for supporting the other side in various wars. But the interesting thing is when you read poetry from this period, poetry by Siegel and other Yiddish poets, they specifically look toward the mountain and the cross, and what they see in it is a sign of great comfort. Might be paradoxical, right? But what they say in their poetry and what they love about Montreal is, generally speaking, religions coexist, the cross is not a threat. In fact, the cross reminds them that they're in a safe place, a relatively safe place, right? And this is a particularity of Montreal, where this cross re-signifies what we call re-signification, right? It's no longer a threatening object, it's an object that reminds them that they don't have to fear it in the way that they did in places that they came from. At the same time, that's not to say that there weren't suspicious attitudes toward Jews in Montreal, and we talked about that this morning too. And I showed this slide this morning because for the Catholic Church in Quebec, and especially its spokespeople like Abbé Groux, right, the French Canadians were in Quebec were the remainder, right, of a Catholic, agricultural, devout civilization in a sea of materialism, right, which was basically Anglo-materialism. But the Jews, too, were seen as outsiders that represented international or cosmopolitan forces, right, and that should not be frequented, right? And so you have these novels that Groux wrote, like The Call of the Race. I explained again that race does not mean race as we use it today, but nationality, right? Be loyal to your nationality, don't mix with strangers, kind of thing, right? At the same time, and again, I'm going to get through this part very quickly, in the factories, in the neighborhood that I showed you, a large part of the workforce was Jewish, and the major industry was the garment industry. Here, Jewish workers worked with French, Canadian, Irish workers, mostly women, for mostly Jewish bosses. Right? The Jewish bosses of these factories, the owners, tended to come from families of German origin, whereas the workers came from families of Eastern European origin. Right? And there were large strikes all through the first decades of the 20th century for better working conditions, better pay, in which the Jewish owners preferred to deal with Catholic unions. So the Catholic unions were set up by the church to bargain on behalf of workers, whereas the union that came in to contest this was the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, largely Jewish in leadership, and had a much more militant position. So the Jewish owners much preferred dealing with the Catholic Church when it came to negotiating labor conditions. Leah Roback was very effective. She was a garment workers union leader. She was born in Quebec City. She was fluent in French, and she was able to organize all workers, not just Jewish workers. But the pressure on the non-Jewish workers was very strong, and there's even a story, which is verified, where after one strike, where the Garment Workers Union won better wages for the workers, the French-Canadian workers were ordered by the church to go back to the boss and return the money, because it was money won through communism, right? So this was the kind of tense situation that existed. So there is, for example, the headquarters of one of the Catholic unions, as you can see. So we're now going to go a little bit further. What did power look like in Quebec at this time? This photograph, which is taken in the 1940s, I think represents it quite well. Remember, in the 1950s, you have the Prime Minister of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis, who we talked about this morning, Cardinal Léger from the Church, and the Chief of the Quebec National Police, right? And the what you have here, though, was a turning point. So this was a very famous strike in 1949 called the asbestos strike, because it took place in a mining community named Asbestos for what was mined, the terrible toxic carcinogen asbestos. And this became, because of the intervention of the church, the combined intervention of the church, the police, and the state, became a turning point in Quebec labor history, because for the first time the Catholic unions broke with the church and acted on behalf of the workers. And it was a significant moment at the beginning of what was called the Quiet Revolution. So this strike got a lot of bad publicity, that is bad publicity for the owners, all across Canada. Here you see, this is from an English newspaper in Western Canada. You see here a striker who's being beaten, but you also see the light coming through the church window. Okay? So it was always seen that the church was a complicit force in this, except, curiously, well, not curiously, this man, Cardinal Léger, was eventually expressed his support for the strikers, right? And was in fact exiled to British Columbia, to a diocese where nobody spoke French, right? So in a sense, the church punished him for this. It's not Léger, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up names, but it'll come to me. So the asbestos strike also was the impetus for a new intellectual journal in Quebec called Cité Libre, the Free City, as it were. And this was a journal that spoke out against the dominance of the church, against clericalism. So clericalism is the abusive exercise of power by the church in areas where it really doesn't have any business, where the church takes it upon itself to proclaim over all social and political questions rather than spiritual ones, right? And the editors of this magazine, of this journal, Cité Libre, were one you might recognize, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who eventually went on to become Prime Minister of Canada, right? And Gérard Peltier, who was his foreign minister, who was very close to Trudeau all through his time when he was in a government, right? So what I'm trying to show you here is that the Quiet Revolution, as it develops in Quebec, is from the very beginning defined as a campaign or a development against clericalism, against the power of the church, and against the power of religious authorities to dictate social policy. It's very important to understand that, to understand what happens later on with the debate over secularism and reasonable accommodation. So here's a contemporary poster by a group that calls itself Le Mouvement Tradition Québec, the movement for traditional Quebec. It's not a very big movement, but they have colorful posters. And you can see that they hate the Quiet Revolution, right? The title of the talk that people are being invited to is The Quiet Revolution and the Destruction of French-Canadian Society, right? So there is this view that everything went wrong in Quebec from the Quiet Revolution on because it destroyed the traditional basis of Quebec society. Right? So here's a little table that, in a nutshell, explains what the Quiet Revolution was. Right? It's in French. So in the Duplessis period, we've talked about Duplessis. He was the Prime Minister of Quebec in the 1950s. You had a period of massive privatization of natural resources, of which Quebec has many. So Duplessis would give public speeches about being faithful to traditions and to the land, but behind the scenes, he was selling off all of Quebec's natural resources to American and British companies and profiting from it. It was a period when, in Duplessis and in the Quiet Revolution, many of these key areas were nationalized, especially hydroelectricity, which I'll show you in a minute. And the nationalization of hydroelectricity became a symbol of modern Quebec. And the huge hydroelectric developments in northern Quebec, which provide power not only to Quebec, but to a large part of the northeastern United States. And of course, it's hydropower, it's water power. It's not from coal, it's not from gas, it's not from nuclear, right? So, before the Quiet Revolution, all social services, including education, medicine, social assistance, were all run by the church, which meant that Jews had their own agencies, right? Obviously, the Jewish community established its own hospitals, and even today in Montreal, you have the Jewish General Hospital, which is a public hospital. You have Jewish social services, but all of these things were run by religious confession, right? Not by the state. After the Quiet Revolution, all of these things became public, became state-run, which doesn't mean that religious groups don't play a role, but they no longer control the policy or the actual institutions. And we talked about this. The economy was in the hands largely of Americans. It's a bit rosy to say that it's not anymore, but it's certainly much less so. And there are many, many large Quebec corporations, some of which you may know: Bombardier, which makes trains and planes all over the world; Power Corporation, which builds dams in Africa and everywhere else. And I could go on. There are Desjardins, which is a cooperative movement, which is now one of the biggest banks in Canada, Hydro-Quebec. So these are some of the fundamental changes that took place in a very short time, in only a few years. The question of language also became very important in the Quiet Revolution. Quebec Français means not ethnically French. It means we want to live in the French language. The majority population in Quebec is French. In the province, it's about 85% French. In Montreal, French has been the majority language for over 100 years. And yet, in this period, if you went downtown in Montreal to do your shopping, you would scarcely know it. Right? You would only hear English. If you went into a restaurant, you'd only get an English menu. If you worked in one of the large department stores and you were French, you were not allowed to speak French with your co-worker who was also French-speaking. Right? The federal government convened a committee to basically to look at the status of French. And what they found is in a province where 85% of the people were French-speaking, which is with their mother tongue, French of 14 ethnic groups was the lowest on the economic ladder. The only group lower than the French were the indigenous population. Right? So the move for Quebec Français was to make French the language of work, the normal language of daily life in Quebec. And this was promoted by a new generation of younger Québécois, French-speaking Québécois, who now had university educations and were educated abroad, and signaled again a huge social shift. Right? This is one of the big James Bay dams that I was telling you about, the nationalization of electricity. And the other major social movements that took root during the Quiet Revolution were things such as feminism, right, which was contemporaneous with developments in the United States and in France. So this was a feminist journal from this period. Until 1948, women did not have the right to vote in Quebec. They were not considered persons under the law. They could not have a bank account. They required their husband's permission to have financial transactions. And within the space of just a couple of years, the new government completely reformed all of this to the point where the laws in Quebec around these issues were the most liberal in all of Canada, and where laws around abortion, for example, were not enforced. So Quebec went from being the most restrictive society to the most liberal society in only a few years. And again, it's very important to remember this as we move forward here. And of course, another symbol of modernization, which opened Quebec to the world during this period, was Expo 67, the World's Fair in Montreal in 1967, which is remembered as the most successful World's Fair ever. It was the most attended and generally considered to be the most successful, and it was held in the year of Canada's centennial, Canada's 100th year anniversary of existence as a country, and of course brought people from all over the world and exposed people in Quebec to cultures from all over the world. Now, during this time, with modernization happening so quickly, there was a move on the part of some people, especially anthropologists and ethnographers, to record what was being lost. And that's very interesting, because as Quebec urbanized and modernized, people could see that aspects of the traditional culture were going to be lost. And so the National Film Board of Canada, in particular, sent out film crews to remote regions of Quebec to record traditional practices on film so that they wouldn't be lost, right? And for example, on one level, a typical Quebec family in the early part of the 20th century could have 10 or 11 children. By the end of the 1960s, a typical Quebec family had 2 children. And that, of course, has to do a lot with a shift in the economic basis of what happens when people move to the cities, when they start working in industry, or especially in professions, right? So one filmmaker, Michel Brault, went out to a remote island in the St. Lawrence River and asked the people there to recreate their traditional dolphin hunt. They would go hunting for dolphins. And he made a film called Pour la suite du monde, for future generations. In other words, to record for future generations the practices of their ancestors, right? And what they would do to catch the dolphins is they'd put these stakes which would confuse the dolphins, and they wouldn't know how to get out, and then they would sort of reel them in. But the reason I mention this is because Michel Brault then went on to make another film called Shabbat Shalom, right? So Brault, in this period, and this is where we move toward the Jewish community again, there's an interest in other communities that seem to preserve their traditions or perhaps not, right? And Shabbat Shalom is the story of a young romance between a Sephardic Jewish woman, a young woman, who lives in Outremont. And Outremont is a sort of upper middle class neighborhood of Montreal, largely French speaking, right? And a young French-Canadian boy who lives in the suburbs. Okay, so next door to the boy's home is a family of Hassidim, because there are Hassidim in Montreal that don't just live downtown, but live in the suburbs as well. The boy comes from a split family. He lives with his father. His mother has left. And his father works during the day. He comes home at night. When it's time for dinner, he takes something out of the freezer and puts it in the microwave and puts it on the table, right? And yet, next door, there's a Hasidic family with many children. And every night, they're all sitting around the table, and there's a big meal that gets put out, and everyone is singing. And you see the Hasidic family through the eyes of these modern Quebecois. And Brault seems to be asking a question. He's saying, well, we're modern now. We live in a modern economy. We have our freedom, but what have we lost, right? And the Hasidim become a kind of romantic symbol in this film for kinds of familial conversation and time that people don't seem to have anymore, right? So this is a scene from the neighbors next door. In literature, too, in this period, there's an interest in the Hasidic community. We're talking the 1970s, 1960s. So this is a novel by a French-Canadian writer called Yves Thériault, and as you can see, the title is Outremont, right? And it's gone through many reprintings. It's remained popular over the years. And it's again a story set in the Hasidic community of Outremont, or Mile End, next door. And it's a typical story about a young boy and his father, and the young boy's curiosity about the world outside, and the father's insistence that he remain loyal to his traditions. So it was a theme that was very familiar to the Quebecois, where sometimes you had parents who wanted their children to be faithful to teachings of the Catholic Church, not to have sex before marriage, to have lots of children, and the children, of course, who were behaving and acting in very different ways. So once again, the Hassidim become a kind of exotic way of exploring issues that the French-Canadian population was experiencing. And there was another film made only a couple of years after Shabbat Shalom. This film is called Bonjour Shalom. And what's this one of? This is a documentary film, right? And it's a film about the encounter in Outremont between the Hasidic population and the ordinary Quebecois French-speaking population. And Gary Beitel, who's Jewish, who's an English speaker, goes into some of the Hasidic schools and interviews the teachers, and he films encounters on the street between Hasidic Jews and non-Hasidim. And this is in the 1990s. There are already tensions, but the film is a hopeful one, right? And it produces this kind of art, right, which is sort of, which you see is kind of expressive of the optimistic attitude that you have, you know, Hasidim on the street and Quebecois ordinary couples, and everyone's getting along and everything is happy, right? So there was this kind of idea that things were going to go well, put it that way. Here are just a couple of Hasidim in the rain on the street, always planning ahead and having plastic around their hats, right? And going shopping with the kids. So these are not far from where I live. It's an area that's very mixed, but which has a sizable Hasidic population now. Another film which came out only a few years ago, and again, just trying to show you that often in, not only in film and in literature, but in the press, for example, when you look at in the French press often, when there's an article about the Jewish community or a Jewish issue, the image that's always used, or almost always used, is one of Hassidim. Even though a very small minority of the Jews in Montreal are Hasidic. Most are like me, right? They're more or less practicing, but certainly not Hasidic. And yet, whenever there's an image of Jews, it's almost always one of a Hasid, because it signifies a difference, right? It's identifiable. So this is a film that was made a few years ago called Félix et Mera. And Félix and Mera live in this neighborhood of Mile End, Outremont. They live a block or two from each other. Mera is a Hasidic woman in a marriage, in an unhappy marriage. And by chance, she and Félix meet one day and begin a romantic affair, right? And this is a film made by a French-Canadian director, right? Which it became a huge success. So here is Félix and Mera. Mera is not in her religious or observant clothes at this point, but here she is with her husband at home and trying to explain to her husband why the marriage isn't working. And he, of course, doesn't understand. And to the credit of the film, they don't make him into a monster, right? He's not a mean person, he's not an evil person, he just doesn't understand, but in the end, he will respect her wishes. So if in fact she wants to leave, and if she wants to leave the community, he will accept that, even though it's very, very difficult for him. There's an organization in New York and in Montreal called Pathways. And this organization was set up by Hassidim who have left their communities to help others who are in that situation, right? So this is not a made-up story in that sense. So here's a scene where Meira is back with her family at dinner. And I don't know if you could read the caption, where she's explaining a voiceover to Felix that she says, "I'm not allowed to look men in the eye." Right? Now that's a very important line, and it's one, again, this is a film made by a French-Canadian director, not a Jewish director, right? And what was interesting is in the tensions, in the early tensions between the Hasidic community and other residents of Outremont, one of the things that came up most often, especially from women, right, was they would say, "These men won't even look me in the eye. They won't even greet me," right? So when I walk down the street, it's like I don't exist, right? And it's a very interesting cultural difference, right? Because of course, when Hasidim don't look women in the eye, it's not out of disrespect. It's the opposite. In their cultural view, right, you only look your wife in the eye, as it were, or your daughter, right? But you have here a real example of cultural misrecognition. So the challenge becomes, how do you deal with an issue like that, where Quebecois women, who, as I remind you, have broken with Catholicism, have broken with the church, which taught them that they should obey men, that they were basically children in the eyes of the law, suddenly walk down a street where men won't look at them. Of course, they interpret that as an insult. Right? So in the neighborhood, and we'll talk about this a little more, there are associations of neighbors that have been established to try and bridge some of these cultural gaps, to try and explain attitudes of each side to the other, so that there's not a constant misinterpretation. There were also more recent books, this one, Hadassah. So Hadassah, written by Myriam Beaubien, a French-Canadian, which is a kind of secret look into the life of a Hasidic woman, right? So again, trying to show you that there's a great deal of interest. There always has been a great deal of interest in the Hasidic community as this kind of odd artifact, right, of traditions that no longer hold much sway in the French-Canadian, the large families, right? Life determined by religious practice, right? Staying with one's kind, right? All of these, which used to be French-Canadian values, somehow remain values within the Hasidic community, except the kind is different, right? So there's always been this fascination. But also, more and more, in some cases, frustration where it's seen almost as a kind of stubbornness. Like, why won't they, right? Why won't they accept a secular existence? But that was exacerbated when Montreal started receiving a large number of Muslim immigrants. Now, it's important to say Arabic is now the third or fourth most spoken language in Montreal, after French and English. It vies with Spanish. We're not sure. Sometimes it's Spanish, sometimes it's Arabic, right? And people come from all over the Middle East, and they are of different degrees of practice, right? The number of women in Montreal who actually would dress like this could probably be counted on a couple of hands, but they become a symbol, especially after 9/11, especially after 9/11. Especially with the rise of discourse about Islamic terrorism and fundamentalism. So they become a kind of public symbol on the street, right, of fear, right? That people begin to fear that their country is being invaded, right, by this force. So those of you who were in my class and saw the kinds of posters and attitudes toward Jews in the first part of the 20th century, many of those same attitudes were now shifted toward Muslims. Right? So what I want to show you are a few areas where this took on quite incredible proportions. So this is a charming little village in Quebec called Hérouville. It's a very lovely photograph, right? It's fall. We have splendid autumn colors in Quebec, thanks to all the maple trees, right? So this is a little village quite far from Montreal where there is no Muslim population. Not a single Muslim lives in this village of a couple of thousand people. And yet the village decided to introduce a code of conduct for people living in Hérouville, which includes things like a man cannot stone a woman to death, right? A man can't burn a woman, right? So out of nowhere, far from where people actually interact, this town became a symbol for all the fear that existed, right? And it got huge amounts of coverage all over Canada, but also all over the world, right? It became a kind of cause célèbre. And much to their credit, a group of Muslim women decided, well, we're going to go visit these people, right? So instead of, being afraid or instead of yelling, they got on a bus and they went to the village of Hérouville and actually sat down and had lunch and talked with people there in order to show them that really, they didn't have that much to be afraid of, that they were very much like them, except their faith was different. And this is a photo of the encounter. But this was all part of a debate, and this is where I started today, about reasonable accommodation. So what does reasonable accommodation mean, right? And does it mean, for example, if you work in a public office, right, is it reasonable to allow you to take Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, even if they fall on a Tuesday and Wednesday, and substitute 2 other days somewhere else along the line? That's a reasonable accommodation, right? Is it reasonable for the state to allow women going to a hospital to only be seen by women doctors? They're not the same thing, right? Is that a reasonable accommodation, or is that basically going against the neutrality of the state and demanding that men or women take a subordinate position? It's a complicated issue, but in the political debate that got going, it was caricatured, right? And so there developed a position in which any accommodation of religious issues became seen as a threat to the secular character of Quebec, right? And the attitude was very much, we fought against the church, right, this generation. We emancipated ourselves from the roles that the Catholic Church assigned to women, for example. We don't want some other religion coming in and telling us what we can and can't do. That was the way it was framed. So here you have the leader of one of the political parties, Québec Solidaire, which is a left-wing party, but opposed, in favor of religious accommodations, let me put it that way, and who's being sort of used as an ottoman by these religious, by a Catholic bishop, an imam, and a Hassid, right? So in other words, if you allow yourself to be flexible on religious issues, you're going to be taken advantage of, and you're opening the door to a benighted religious society, right? So there were these very, very strong attitudes. One example, and this was a very interesting one, and people came down, so there is a YMCA. Do you know what YMCAs are? They're like sports centers, right? So sports and cultural centers. They're public institutions. So there's a YMCA in this neighborhood of Mile and Outremont, which is, as I said, a very mixed neighborhood of very kind of young professionals, hipsters, and Hassidim. The gym, if the windows of the gymnasium of the fitness center of the YMCA look out over a Hasidic school with its windows. The Hassidim who run the school went to the YMCA and asked them to cover their windows with curtains because they didn't want their boys seeing women exercising. So there's an example. Is that a reasonable demand for a religious accommodation or not? Many women said absolutely not. We're not going to hide ourselves because a religious group thinks that we're somehow indecent. And that included many Jewish women, right? This was not a French-Canadian issue. It was many Jewish women who said, no way am I going to put a curtain there, so that because these boys think that I'm a threat or I'm a temptation, right? They said, you put the curtains on your school windows, right? If you want curtains, you put them up, right? But these are the kind of day-to-day issues that would sort of come up, but that became political issues. Another one, a group of Hasidim rented a hotel resort for Pesach, for Passover, right? And this is a hotel that during the year, residents in the area can buy memberships to its pool and its spa, right? But during Passover, the whole place is rented to the Hasidic community, and they have separate hours in the swimming pool for men and for women. This became a public issue. People said, this is an unreasonable, it's scandalous that you're making women and men swim at different times. But it was a private event in a private business, right? So that's a very different issue. For those 8 days, the Hasidim have rented the place and can do with it what they like, according to their own rules, right? So these were, I'm just trying to show you that what are in fact very complex questions and situations become painted with a very broad stroke, right? As any acknowledgement of religious belief is a threat, right? So then we come to the Quebec government's Charter of Values, which it decided to introduce, in which the most contentious clause was one that would prohibit state workers from wearing what were called conspicuous religious symbols. Okay, so in Quebec, the state plays a very, very large role in the economy. It's not, this included daycare, creche workers, teachers, hospital workers, and so it was a huge sector of the workforce that would have been affected. So the Quebec government put out these posters to show what they thought constituted conspicuous religious symbols, right? And as you can see, a kippah is one of them, right? And it's obviously not just Hasidim who wear kippahs, but and then the Orthodox Jews as well. But as you can see, a big cross wouldn't be allowed, right? A hijab would not be allowed. A turban would not be allowed. And we have many Sikhs in Canada. In fact, the leader of our Social Democratic Party now is a Sikh who wears a turban. We have Sikh, our Minister of Defense is a Sikh who wears a turban. It's a large community in Canada. The niqab, obviously, would be prohibited, and the kippah. But just to show that they weren't against all religious symbols, they also put a poster which would show which ones would be allowed. Right? So these apparently are not conspicuous, right? You could have a little cross, right? You could have earrings with crosses on them or whatever, Jewish star, Magen David's or whatever. Or you could have a ring with a Magen David. That would be okay. So you can imagine this was a feast for political satirists, right? And I'll show you some of the responses. So this is one which says, Charter of Quebec Values. not a Quebec value, not a Quebec value, not a Quebec value. There's someone who's a true Quebecois, right? A hockey fan, right? So all of these well-behaved people who are adhering to their traditions, you can't get a job in the state because if you did not follow this rule, that was what was proposed, this never was passed, you would not be able to work for the state, but he can, right? Similarly, face covering has no place in our society, right? And everyone knew that the prime target of this face covering law, of the conspicuous symbol law, were Muslim women, right? And the debate really was over, on the state on the one hand and religious authorities on the other hand, telling women what they can and cannot wear, right? So here again, in Montreal, most people have head coverings in the winter for obvious reasons. And here's a woman in a burqa, a Quebec flag burqa, right? And she's saying, do I show my adherence to Quebec values now? So there's hundreds and hundreds of these cartoons. But there were also demonstrations, right, against the Charter of Values. And some women actually took that seriously, so they wear Quebec flag hijabs to show that they consider themselves to be full-fledged Quebecois, right? That they are, and they're marching along with others, right? Who clearly in this particular photo are largely from the South Asian community, but there are other demonstrations which are very, very mixed. At the same time, the Canadian government, the previous government under Stephen Harper, saw an opportunity. There was a Canadian election at the same time, and they created what was called the Office of Religious Freedom, right? And this office was to basically defend persecuted religious groups around the world, which was all very nice. But at the same time, they were closing down scientific laboratories and prohibiting their employees from talking about things like climate change. It was prohibited for a federal scientist to use the term climate change when Harper was Prime Minister of Canada. You think that's a Trump policy, but actually we went through this in Canada, but we're more polite, so you don't hear about it as much. Harper is, but the hypocrisy, the other thing the Conservatives did in the election, trying to capitalize on this debate in Quebec, was say that they would set up what they called a barbaric practices hotline, so that if you suspected your neighbor was engaging in a barbaric practice, like beating his wife or whatever, you could call this a special number. So it was actually fueling this kind of campaign of fear, and they thought they would get an advantage of this in the election, but they lost the election to Justin Trudeau. Just as the Quebec government that proposed the Charter of Values lost its election, right? So in both cases, there was not sufficient support electorally for this to come into force. This is a pro-Charter of Values demonstration, and as you see, it's very much linked to certain secular notions, but also something like this: feminine beauty should not be hidden. Well, there's a value statement. So interpreting the hijab, right, as necessarily a sign of the suppression of women, right, and necessarily a sign of hiding feminine beauty. And of course, there's many critiques that can be made of such a poster, but there was a large debate in Quebec. This issue divided people who were usually allies, and that's another very interesting aspect of this debate. The feminist community was completely divided. There were those feminists who said the hijab or the niqab is invariably and absolutely a sign of women's subordination, and that to even allow it on our streets is to go backward, right? And then there were women who said, well, if you want women to integrate into the society, if you want them to become part of the workforce, how can you support a law which will prohibit them from working because of what they're wearing? This is counterproductive. And a hijab in Egypt, for example, where it was a sign, right, of a repressive policy toward women, is not the same as a hijab in Montreal. A symbol doesn't mean the same thing in all contexts. The same thing among political leaders. The party that supports Quebec independence, that works for the independence of Quebec, was split. The three former prime ministers of that party opposed this law because they said that it would tell immigrants that an independent Quebec would always be disrespectful of them, right? Whereas part of the party said no, if they're going to be here in Quebec, they have to adhere to these values. So this was an issue that split all kinds of traditional alliances. And on the one hand, you had this strange alliance of very, very non-religious people and very, very religious Christians together in support of the Charter of Quebec values, and people who were in the middle, right, on both sides, sort of against this charter. So here's another anti-Charter of Values demonstration with French and English signs. Right? This is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious kind of demonstration. So now we come back to Outremont and the Hassidim, and this is the last part. So because of all of these events, the Hassidic community in Outremont finds itself in a very different place. It used to be, as I said, mostly looked at as a kind of an exotic feature. But now, through the lens of this growing fear of religious invasion or the imposition of religious values, things have become tenser. So this is a map of the Eruv, of the Hasidic community in Outremont, in this neighborhood. Do you know what an Eruv is? Someone know what an Eruv is? So you know that on Sabbath, on the Shabbat, and on high Jewish holidays, it's forbidden to do work or to light fires. So the Eruv kind of creates a kind of imaginary home or community within which certain things are permitted. And they're marked just by putting a piece of string high up on street poles. So this is the Eruv of Outremont, where there is now a large Hasidic population.
It's written in Yiddish.
Hmm?
It's written in Yiddish.
It's written, yeah. Here, this is all in Yiddish. No,
Yiddish, Erev Shabbos. Yeah, that's Yiddish.
yeah, this is Yiddish. Yeah, so. So it's what? Bechorot HaRabbanim, something. So Hebrew Yiddish. Some words in Hebrew are obviously used in Yiddish when they're religiously oriented. But in any case, so this imaginary community, some people in the neighborhood began to feel that like this was like the Twilight Zone or something. Like they were being inscribed in some territory that they didn't agree to. Right? And so this was like one of the first areas of tension. The next area became the Sukkah Controversy. So in Montreal, most apartments and most homes have balconies, especially in dense urban areas. So where are people going to build their sukkot? They don't have backyards. They barely have front yards. So of course, most of them build them on their balconies. Well, the neighbors again of Outremont, this particular group, decided that this was a kind of aggression and it was a visual form of aggression, and tried to pass a bylaw in Outremont that would prohibit people from having sukkot on their balconies. Right? So first no eruv, then no sukkah, right? And this was all these issues were all basically put forward by the same group of people, right, who looked at Outremont and the changing relationship of the populations, where the Hasidic population was growing and the traditional francophone population was going down, and who basically felt threatened, right? And so any visual symbol of Hasidic life was seen as a kind of threat. So that was the next controversy. Now, the Hassidim are not known traditionally for participating in civic political life, but this kind of changed things. At least it changed things for one woman, whose name is Mindy Pollock, and she decided to run to be a counselor for the Outremont borough, where this community is. So this was interesting, because generally speaking, women in the Hasidic community are not encouraged to have public roles of this kind, right? That's not how women's roles are seen normally, and she decided to go ahead. And it was going to be a question of whether the men in her community would come out and even vote for her, right? And we know from some of the campaigns that, in fact, many of the leaders, the male leaders of the Hasidic community, went and supported the other candidate. But not all. But she was elected. And she was elected, she couldn't have been elected if only Hasidim had voted for her. She was elected by a large coalition of people who felt that the Hasidim, who were a significant population in the neighborhood, deserved and should have a voice on city council. And she was very talented. She was a very good person at building bridges. And so a lot of young, non-religious people, a lot of francophones, a lot of secular Jews who live in the neighborhood voted for her, and she won. Here she is again, in front of the polling station, right? So she's been a city council member for the last few years, as new measures have come in. So the Hasidic community is not the traditional Jewish community of this part of Montreal. The traditional Jewish community had synagogues like this, Beit Yaakov, right? And as you can see, it's a grand building. This traditional Jewish community moved out of this neighborhood in the 1950s and 60s, left these buildings behind. This one has been totally converted into a school, a private school, a French school. And if you look from the street, if you go back far enough, you can see the Hebrew writing on the arch, but the rest of it has been totally changed, so you wouldn't know it was a synagogue. So these are the big synagogues of the Jewish community that lived in this neighborhood in the 1930s, 1940s. But the Hasidim don't have such buildings. They have little study centers like this, right? They buy a house or two houses, and they turn them into Beit Midrashim and little synagogues. And again, always organized according to the particular Hasidic rabbi from Europe that they follow. So they're the Satmars, from Satmar, the Belts, and I could go on and on. Again, the neighbors become alarmed, right? And now the initiative was taken to ban the building of new religious institutions on major streets in Outremont. So of course they can't say we're going to ban synagogues because that would be discriminatory. So they say we'll ban religious buildings, but there are no new churches being built. And everyone knows that it's a rule to ban synagogues. And this again caused a huge controversy. Why did they want to ban them? Because it would ruin the commercial nature of the street. Right? This is like a big commercial street with cafes and restaurants. And someone joked that it's the first time that anyone ever accused Jewish people of ruining business. Right? So it was but again, the same group that had organized around the Erev, around the Sukkah, right, is now organizing around this. And there were public consultations that were held. This is a Hassid who went to one of the hearings and is holding up a banner which says, phony consultation, consultation bidon, you know. And there was a referendum, and the referendum passed narrowly. So it is now illegal to build religious institutions on these commercial streets. But the other thing, of course, is that every time the Hasidim have tried to build a new religious institution on a residential street, like the ones I showed you, those are systematically rejected. So there is a real question. It's, again, there are efforts to try and contain the Hasidic population, as it were. The final controversy I want to tell you about is one that happened just a month or two ago. So the Hassidim have their own schools, and they deliver the children to and from schools in these school buses. Now, there's a long controversy because the Hassidim in Montreal are in constant relation with Hassidim in New York City. And they have exchanges. So the New York ones come up on their buses, the Montreal ones go down. When I lived in the neighborhood, I was one of the only people in my building who was not a Hassid in those couple of years. This is a long time ago. The buses would come, they would park, and then they would idle because they couldn't turn the motors off on Shabbos. And this was indeed an inconvenience. There's no question that having an idling bus in front of your house for a day was no fun, right? And there were solutions found to that. But now the complaint was that there were too many of these buses on residential streets, which is where the children live after all, and where they have to be dropped off. And so the same group showed up at a city council meeting about a month ago, asking for a law to be passed that would ban the buses from these streets. Right? But they made a little error. As you see, they're wearing a symbol, right? And the symbol is yellow. Does that remind you of anything? Now, the reason they're wearing a yellow symbol is because it's a yellow square. There was a large student movement in Quebec about 4 or 5 years ago. Students went out on strike for weeks and months because they were opposed to tuition increases in the universities and what they saw as the neoliberal encroaching policies of higher education and demanding free tuition. And they wore little red squares, right? They were called carrés rouges, right? So this group decided, well, we're going to take the idea of a square, but we're going to make our squares yellow because that's the color of school buses, right? So it's a classic example of ignorance and willful ignorance. So here they show up at a city council meeting where there is a large Hasidic presence, right? Wearing little yellow squares, and you can imagine, right? So it caused a huge controversy. The question wasn't whether they were knowingly doing this, but actually the opposite. How did they not know that wearing a yellow square would be extremely offensive? And the mayor, who's a new mayor of the city, a young man, has actually used the opportunity to set up a kind of dialogue committee between the Hasidics and non-Hasidic members of the community. So this is a formal committee. And as I said before, there have been informal committees that have been working on these issues for years. So basically, as I say, the Hasidic community, and here's a nice picture. You know, I showed you that sort of cartoon before of Hassidim and not Hassidim getting along. This is a real photo of Mindy Pollock and a non-Hasidic woman getting along on the street as neighbors. What has happened with the Hasidic community is because of its demographic growth, and because of not only in terms of the city of Outremont, the district of Outremont, but in proportionately to the rest of the Jewish community in Montreal. The Jewish community in Montreal is like the rest of North America. People have 1 or 2 children. But the Hasidim are having 8 and 10 children. They're like the French Canadians used to be, right? And so the proportion of Hasidim in the Montreal Jewish community is, of course, going up because they have a much higher birth rate and they don't leave. In fact, they're coming to Montreal, right? There are all kinds of matches that are made between Hasidic men in Montreal and women in New York, right? So it's a growing community which is also affecting the internal politics and culture of the Jewish community, right? But it's also much more present in this part of the city. So there are Hasidim now who see the importance of intervening and not simply staying to themselves, but intervening in the political life of the city. But the interpretation of the Hasidic community by the society at large has moved from one of being a kind of curiosity and one that perhaps reminds people nostalgically of certain things they might have given up as they modernized, to now being seen as part of the religious threat, right? To being seen as part of the threat of religious fundamentalism and a threat to secularism and a threat to pluralism. And this is a role which they're not accustomed to, right? Because for whatever, for many reasons, they were fundamentally left alone. Anti-Semitism in Quebec, when it existed, was not particularly anti-Hasidic, right? It was more about international capital. It was more about cosmopolitanism, right? It was more about Jews as Christ killers at some point. But now the Hasidic community in particular is being interpreted through this new lens of religious fundamentalism and religious tyranny, right? That they want us to be like them, which of course they don't, right? That's the farthest thing from their minds. The only ones they want to be like them are people like me, right? And they try and, they hang out at schools in Montreal looking for Jewish kids to put tefillin on and things like this. In any case, so that's a picture, I think, of a very complicated issue and the way that it's playing out in Quebec today. Thank you. Questions or comments?
Is the cross still there on the mountain where you show?
Oh yeah, it's there, and it's kind of a pop culture symbol. So what they did is, it became very, people are kind of affectionate about their cross now. There are certain visual signs in Montreal that cannot be changed. There's a sign for a flower, like a pastry flower called 5 Roses. The company doesn't exist anymore, but the neon sign still flashes because it's a bilingual sign that says Farine 5 Roses. And Pillsbury, another company, bought this factory, but they can't take the sign down because people identify with it as part of Montreal. And the same with the cross. So it became a kind of quirky symbol when John Paul II, when Pope Paul VI died, there was a tradition that when a pope died, they would take all the light bulbs out of the cross that were white and replace them with purple light bulbs, right, as a sign of mourning. So Paul VI died, John Paul I became pope. About a month after he became pope, they took all the purple light bulbs out, put in the white ones, and then he died. So they had to go back and put all the purple light bulbs. And this became a kind of joke in Montreal. And since then, the cross has been used with all different colors of light bulbs to symbolize different events, right? And about a couple of years ago, they replaced light bulbs altogether with fiber optics, right? So now we have a fiber optic high-tech cross that can communicate all kinds of messages at any time. Now, we have this company in Montreal called Moment Factory. And Moment Factory is one of the leading light and image companies in the whole world. It does things like Madonna's concerts, the halftime show at the Super Bowl, and they do a lot of work in Montreal too. So it's become very part of Montreal culture, but nobody wants to see it go, really. Questions?
But there is a contradiction that the cross is still standing and you don't allow the religious signs on the public streets.
Yes. Well, of course, this law was never passed, right? Now, there is a law that was just passed that does prohibit the wearing of religious symbols for certain public workers, except that a judge, and this was passed by the current Quebec government, which follows the recommendations of a commission called the Bhushan-Tailor Commission that happened over 10 years ago. Some of you may have heard of Charles Tailor. He's an internationally known philosopher from Montreal. So he and Gérard Bouchard, who's a prominent sociologist, led this commission. And they proposed that the wearing of religious signs by state workers be allowed for everyone except those in positions of authority, like policemen and judges, for example. The other parties want a broader one, but in any case, this law was passed recently, But a judge has intervened and said, you cannot put this law into effect until you provide guidelines on how you're going to enforce it. Because the law says is if you have your head covered, right, not conspicuous religious symbols, but if you have your head covered, you cannot give or receive a state service. So not only can you not drive a bus, you can't get on a bus, right, if your head is covered. Now, of course, the bus drivers are saying this is ridiculous. We're not going to enforce this. Show us how we're going to enforce this. Is a person on a 30 below day wearing a balaclava because he's cold going to be refused entry to a bus? Or are you really, talking about Muslim women again? Right? So the judge said, unless you could come up with viable guidelines, this part of the bill cannot be put into force. And of course, the government has no desire or interest in coming up with guidelines. It only passed it because it felt that it was politically expedient. It doesn't want to be attacked by the opposition parties. So the big contradiction is that in the National Assembly in Quebec, there is still a crucifix. So in the secular National Assembly, behind the Speaker's throne is a crucifix. And people have legitimately said, well, that's a pretty conspicuous religious symbol. If you're going to ban these religious symbols, you should take down this crucifix. And the answer was, no, that's not a religious symbol, that's a cultural symbol. Right? It's a symbol of our heritage, right? So again, this produced enormous quantities of caricatures and cartoons and satires, right? So these issues they're not logical. I mean, one shouldn't look for consistency, right? One's really looking at issues of how people interact with others who do not believe as they do, or who have particular obligations according to their religions. There's a fundamental misunderstanding, and the people often who are in favor of these restrictions say, well, people choose to wear these things. It's not an obligation, and all they're doing is showing off, right? Like religion is a private matter. You can be as religious as you like, but do that in private. It's a matter between you and God, right? And of course, strictly speaking, for Christians, there is no obligation to wear any particular clothing, right? Many Christians do choose to wear crosses or crucifixes. But for Orthodox Jews or Sikhs, right, there is a religious obligation. This is not a matter of choice, right? And it has nothing to do with showing off. It has to do with respect toward God, right? So there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what these are. And not to mention, when a man appears in a beard, is it a beard because he's a hipster? Or is it a beard because he's a Muslim, right? And do we behave differently? Do we give them a test? I'm being not really facetious, but I'm trying to show that the whole issue is by definition illogical when you look at it that way. If you look at it as a militant secularist and say there should be no public display of religion in public space, then that's a consistent logical position, except it runs up against reality all the time in ways that make it pretty unviable unless you're willing to sacrifice a great amount of democratic and civic rights. Right? So in essence, there's a large contradiction, as always, between politics and practice. Right? Politics are a radical discourse in the sense that they want you to choose sides, you're for or against something. Politics, for many, is the art of black and white, whereas practice is the art of gray. Right? And Quebecers actually get along very well living in the gray zone. It's a very creative and productive and pleasant place to live because there's so much play in that gray zone. And every now and then politicians try to capitalize on feelings that are held, right? Not, sometimes reasonable ones, sometimes ones of fear, to win votes, but in the end it doesn't seem to work most of the time. People actually, when push comes to shove, won't take that final step. They won't actually vote for something that tells their neighbor that no, you cannot have a job because you're wearing a kippah, or They won't do that, even though, you know, they might complain, oh, those Hasidic women look oppressed, or as, you know, they, out of some form of cultural miscommunication. Thank you very much.
Thank you.